Gay Hendricks calls it the upper limit problem, where somebody's on a threshold of doing something great and they'll purposefully or subconsciously sabotage it in
Oh,
all sorts of
wow.
different ways, whether they do something reckless with their lives or they get sick. You get that dream job and then you get sick for 2 weeks and it doesn't work out. And Gay Hendricks said that there's been so many instances where he would feel himself getting sick and he would pause to reflect and think, I'm not getting sick. This is probably just an upper limit problem. And he would pause to reflect and think about
Oh,
where in his life he was, holding himself back in somewhere, or where he called it, where was there a pebble in the hose? Where are you out of integrity in your life? And of course, he would go through this process and he wouldn't get sick at all. I've started to do that, and I haven't been sick in over a year. Also, fighting for my 8 hours of sleep helps too. But
well, I've taken some notes here on my little envelope. If you want, I'd be happy to riff on your riff there. That's fascinating. What was the guy's name who discussed this upper limit problem?
Gay Hendricks.
Okay, okay. Um, so self-esteem, because I'm tying everything back to flow these days, so we might as well do that. One of the aspects I talked about, this default mode network, when it downregulates, our sense of self changes. And biologically speaking, I've been a big fan of Zen. I also grew up raised on the Christian side, and I've found personally, for me, a way to blend those. I'd be happy to chat about that, but I don't think it's worth unpacking. But this down regulation of the default mode network, I think what it does is it allows us to further integrate processing centers that are not verbal, and enhances because the verbal is always will slow us down because we have to interpret it. And so you mentioned integrity, and a lot of the times what I think of when I think of an integrity is that I'm not blocking myself. And if we have this default mode network online that is always concerned about the future and money and what are we going to eat what for dinner, and do I need to go shopping, and the biologic function of that, it's important. It allows us to cross the street. If we don't have a sense of self, we don't plan how to cross the busy street with the concept of, well, we don't want to get in front of that bus. Or it also tells us which mouth to put our fork into. So it has a biologic function, but when it runs the show, I think this crosses more into Zen, you have a schism that doesn't feel right in our body. It's just a feeling, versus when we're in flow, we have a sense that we know it feels right. It just does. So you talked about getting sick, and that reminded, and then thinking and making yourself better. What in the world is the placebo effect? When we do a randomized controlled trial to test a new drug, we test to see if it's better than placebo. We don't test to see if it works. We test to see if it's better than placebo, because if you give a sugar pill to somebody with a condition, 30% of them get better just magically. And maybe it's not magic. Maybe it's a story that we're telling ourselves that, oh, I'm in this clinic, everybody's wearing these white coats, I had to sign in at the front desk, I had to fill out this paperwork, this must work. And I believe it works, and placebo effect. So part of the placebo effect may be this story. And what I'm starting to become interested in on another side path that relates to flow is what happens when we downregulate this self. It allows us to function in a more flow-like, productive manner. And this limit of upper limit problem is almost like the opposite of a placebo. I'll share with you, you shared with me a little bit about, 1883, checking in. I think a lot of our trauma that we receive, we minimize. Like, oh, like I had a little trauma, but I know everybody has it a lot worse than me. And so I feel that way about my trauma. But some of my trauma came as a newborn. I had a very challenging forceps birth. My face was so bruised and beaten up, my dad was embarrassed to share my baby photo with anybody. But my mom was a pediatric nurse and she wanted to do the cutting edge thing, plus she had to work. So I was one of the first babies really in the mid 60s to get formula, and it was a soy-based formula. And I blew up and I gained so much weight. I got so fat. We know today that you just let the baby gain weight and that they'll grow out of it. But the doctors at the time got worried and they put me on a skim milk diet where I was fed 2 bottles at 2 different times of the day and no lipids of skim milk. It was nutritionally devastating. But the really devastating thing, I think, for me, Greg, was when I cried, I didn't get food, but I knew that there's food in the refrigerator. So the response of me as a newborn asking for what I'm needing and the response of the universe to give me care and feeding and comfort was not there. And I think that has impacted me in business because it makes it hard for me to ask for what I'm worth. It makes it hard for me to ask for what I need because I just had been programmed as a young age. So no matter what I ask and no matter how hard I cry, because that's the way I would communicate as an infant, as a newborn, the universe does not respond. Some people would hear that and say, oh, that's devastating. But for me, I don't think that's a problem. I spoke with a nurse in Bosnia because he's very into the endocannabinoid system, as am I. And he was telling me about his trauma and his war trauma. And I thought, man, that is so much unbelievable trauma to be hunted as a human, not as a civilian even. And so when sharing my story with him, I minimized it, and he said, Jake, no, I feel the same way about my trauma, meaning he minimizes it. So I guess the point in this is we shouldn't minimize our trauma, but we should be aware of this in a story-like format when we are encountering our upper limits.